Something is moving through the forests of the eastern United States that has not been there in over 100 years. Not in the way wildlife biologists mean when they talk about occasional sightings, dispersing individuals, animals that crossed from somewhere else and kept moving. What is happening now is different. It is happening in multiple states simultaneously. It is happening with a regularity and a geographic spread that the standard explanations for isolated wildlife sightings do not comfortably accommodate. Black bears are appearing in states where the species has been functionally absent since the late 1800s. Not one bear, not two. Bears, plural, in numbers that suggest not dispersal events, but something that looks, to people paying careful attention, like the early stages of recolonization. If you have been following stories like this one, if this kind of reporting on wildlife and the changing relationship between wild animals and the places humans have built matters to you, subscribe now. There is more of this coming, and you should be there for it. The states involved are not the ones you would expect if you were thinking about bear range in the traditional sense. Everyone understands that black bears live in the Appalachians, in the Great Smoky Mountains, in the forests of northern Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan. Those populations are established, documented, and not in dispute. The bears that are generating attention now are appearing in places like Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kansas, states that are, in the mental geography most people carry around, cornfields and suburbs and river towns, not bear country. States where the species has not maintained a breeding population in living memory, where the last confirmed resident bears were killed sometime in the decades following the Civil War, when the clearing of the eastern and midwestern forests for agriculture completed a process of habitat destruction that had been underway since European settlement, and that removed the ecological conditions under which black bears could survive. Those bears did not go somewhere else. They were killed. The habitat was eliminated. The population was extirpated, which is the technical term wildlife biologists use when a species is eliminated from a specific geographic area while still surviving elsewhere. Extirpated, not extinct. The distinction matters enormously because extirpation is, in theory, reversible. What is happening right now in the Midwest and in parts of the lower Midwest and Great Plains suggests that, in the case of the black bear, the reversal is underway. To understand why this is happening and what it means, it is necessary to start with what actually happened to bears in these states in the first place, because the history of that disappearance is not well understood outside of wildlife biology circles, and because understanding it correctly is the only way to understand the significance of what is now being reversed. Black bears were, before European colonization of North America, one of the most widely distributed large mammals on the continent. Their range extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from Mexico to the subarctic. They occupied every habitat type that could support sufficient food resources, which is nearly all of them, because black bears are among the most ecologically flexible large mammals in North America. They eat almost anything: berries, nuts, roots, insects, small mammals, carrion, fish, agricultural crops, garbage. Their caloric requirements are high, specifically in the fall hyperphagia period, when they are accumulating fat reserves for winter denning. But their food sources are diverse enough that they can meet those requirements in a wide range of ecological contexts. They den in winter, which gives them a physiological mechanism for surviving periods of low food availability that many other large mammals lack. They are intelligent, adaptable, and capable of learning behavioral patterns specific to local conditions, with a speed and flexibility that is unusual among large mammals. None of these characteristics were sufficient to protect them from what happened between roughly 1600 and 1900 in the eastern and Midwestern United States. The process of their disappearance from states like Iowa and Illinois was not complicated. It was direct. The forests were cut down, The agricultural conversion of the eastern and midwestern United States eliminated the large contiguous forest blocks that black bears require for denning, foraging, and population maintenance. Bears can use fragmented habitat more successfully than some other species, but they cannot maintain viable breeding populations in landscapes that are overwhelmingly agricultural, with only small, scattered woodlots providing forest cover. The minimum viable habitat configuration for a self-sustaining black bear population requires blocks of contiguous forest substantial enough to support the home range requirements of multiple breeding females, which, in the eastern United States, run between 6 and 60 square miles, depending on habitat quality, and multiple male home ranges of considerably larger size overlapping those female territories. When the forest coverage in a region drops below the threshold needed to support those configurations, the remaining bears can persist for a generation or two as isolated individuals, but the population mathematics turn negative, and the animals die out without being replaced. That is what happened in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and the other Midwestern states. The last bears did not flee. They persisted as long as individuals could persist, and then they were gone. What has changed? And the answer to this question is the core of why what is happening right now is significant, is a combination of factors that operate simultaneously at the level of the bears' source populations: the quality of the habitat in the states where bears are now appearing, and the regulatory environment that determines whether bears moving into new areas are killed or allowed to persist. These three factors have been shifting, independently and in parallel, in directions that collectively make black bear recolonization of large parts of the Midwest not merely possible, but apparently underway. And they have been shifting for long enough that the process now appears to have developed its own momentum. The source population question is the place to start because it is the most direct driver of what wildlife managers call range expansion pressure. Black bear populations across the eastern United States have been growing since the 1970s. Not in every state and not uniformly, but the aggregate trend is unambiguous. The states with the largest and most robust established bear populations, including Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Appalachian states generally, have seen their bear populations grow to levels that are now producing significant outward dispersal pressure. Pennsylvania's black bear population, which was estimated at a few thousand animals in the 1970s, is now estimated at somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 animals. West Virginia's population has expanded from a few isolated mountainous counties to cover most of the state. Virginia's bears have moved from the Appalachian spine into the Piedmont and are being documented in counties that had not seen bears in decades. The Ozark populations in Missouri and Arkansas have grown substantially. The Great Lakes populations in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota have been expanding southward into habitat that was marginally occupied or unoccupied a generation ago. The growth of these populations is the product of three converging factors: the end of bounty systems and the transition to regulated hunting management in the 1960s and 1970s reduced harvest pressure below the level that was suppressing population growth. The regrowth of eastern forests, following the decline of marginal agricultural land, created the habitat conditions that growing populations required. And the hard-won legal protections for large carnivores that wildlife advocates pushed for through the middle decades of the 20th century reduced incidental mortality from trapping and poisoning to levels that allowed population growth to accelerate. The result is source populations that are now large, demographically healthy, and producing surpluses of young bears, particularly young males, that cannot be accommodated within the established range without increased competition and decreased reproductive success. Those young males move. They move because they are pushed out of established territories by older, dominant males. They move because the caloric resources in saturated habitat are insufficient for animals that have not yet established territories of their own. They move because black bears, and young male black bears in particular, are capable of extraordinary long-distance movements that reflect a dispersal biology shaped by deep evolutionary history for exactly this kind of outward expansion. The distance these animals can travel is one of the facts about black bear biology that is consistently underestimated by people who think about bear range in terms of static maps with fixed boundaries. Young male black bears have been documented traveling distances of 100, 200, and in exceptional cases over 300 miles from their natal areas in search of new territories. They move through agricultural landscapes, cross major rivers, navigate suburban corridors, and arrive in places that have not had bears in generations. Most of these dispersing individuals do not survive. They are killed on roads, they are killed by farmers protecting livestock. They are killed by hunters in states with liberal bear harvest regulations, or in states where the legal framework for bear management does not accommodate the distinction between a resident breeding bear and a dispersing transient. But some of them survive. Some of them find habitat. And in the states where the habitat has been quietly improving for decades and where the regulatory environment has been slowly shifting toward tolerance, some of those dispersing individuals are not only surviving, but producing offspring, which is the moment at which dispersal becomes something more consequential. The habitat improvement story is the one that receives the least attention in media coverage of bear reappearances, and it is possibly the most important part of the picture. The states where bears are now appearing are not the same states they were in 1970 from the perspective of forest cover and ecological connectivity. Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio have all experienced measurable increases in forest cover over the past 5 decades, primarily in the form of riparian corridor reforestation along the major river systems, state forest expansion, and the conversion of marginal agricultural land into conservation reserve areas under federal programs that incentivize landowners to remove unproductive cropland from production and establish permanent vegetative cover. The net change in any individual county may be modest. The aggregate change across a region, when evaluated in terms of the linear connectivity of forested corridors along rivers, is substantial. Black bears do not require large contiguous forest blocks in the same way that species like wolves or wolverines do. They can use linear corridors. They can navigate landscapes that are primarily agricultural, as long as sufficient cover and food resources are distributed through those landscapes in ways that allow movement and foraging. The riparian corridors along rivers like the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Des Moines, the Wabash, and the Illinois River system have been expanding and improving for decades, and those corridors connect directly back to the source populations in the Ozarks, in the Appalachians, and in the Great Lakes states. The documentation of bears in these states has been accumulating for long enough now that the pattern is no longer ambiguous. In Iowa, black bear sightings were essentially non-existent prior to the 1990s. Through the 1990s and 2000s, occasional reports came from the northeastern corner of the state, the region closest to the Wisconsin and Minnesota populations, and the most heavily forested part of a largely agricultural state. Those reports were treated by wildlife managers as isolated dispersal events, individual animals that had crossed from neighboring states and would move on or die without establishing residence. Through the 2010s, the frequency of credible sightings increased, and their geographic distribution expanded southward and westward from the initial cluster in the northeast. By the early 2020s, bear reports were coming from counties in central and southern Iowa, including confirmed photographic and trail camera documentation that wildlife managers could not characterize as misidentification. The Iowa Department of Natural Resources, which does not have a bear management program because Iowa does not have a resident bear population in the legal or regulatory sense, has been fielding an increasing volume of bear reports and has been responding with communications that carefully avoid characterizing the sightings as the leading edge of recolonization, while also not characterizing them as isolated anomalies, because the data no longer clearly supports either characterization. Illinois presents a similar pattern with a similar ambiguity in the official response. The state had no documented black bear presence for most of the 20th century. Reports began accumulating from the southern portion of the state, the Shawnee National Forest region, in the far south, that represents the most ecologically connected part of Illinois to the Ozark and Appalachian source populations, in the 2000s, and accelerated through the 2010s. Illinois wildlife managers have confirmed bear presence in the state through track, scat, and trail camera documentation in multiple counties. The population estimate, to the extent that one exists, is extremely small, measured in single digits or low tens. But the demographic significance of even a small number of confirmed individuals depends on their age and sex composition. A confirmed presence that includes breeding females is categorically different from a confirmed presence consisting entirely of transient males. The documentation from Illinois includes female bears, which is the data point that changes the conversation from dispersal events to potential recolonization. Indiana has documented bears in its southern counties with increasing regularity. Ohio, a state that most people would not associate with bear presence in any context, has confirmed bears in its eastern and southern counties, the regions with the most direct habitat and geographic connectivity to the Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia populations, with a frequency that wildlife managers have noted publicly while continuing to characterize the animals as transients rather than residents. The characterization of transient versus resident is not semantic. It has legal and regulatory implications for how the animals are managed, how landowners can respond to their presence, and what resources wildlife agencies allocate to monitoring them. The pressure to maintain the transient characterization comes from multiple directions simultaneously. Agricultural interests that oppose bear establishment prefer the transient framing because it preserves the regulatory flexibility to remove individual bears that cause problems without triggering the protections that would attach to an established resident population. Wildlife agencies with limited budgets prefer the transient framing because establishing a bear management program is expensive and complex. The transient framing also postpones the public communication challenge of telling people in states that have thought of themselves as outside bear country for 5 or 6 generations that bears are back and that the recreational, agricultural, and residential adjustments appropriate to bear country are now relevant to their lives. The Kansas situation is worth examining in some detail because it represents the most geographically surprising data point in the current recolonization picture, and because the official and public response to bear appearances in Kansas reveals something instructive about how wildlife management systems handle species returning outside their anticipated range. Kansas is not, by any standard ecological description, bear country. The state is predominantly grassland and agricultural. Its forest cover is limited to the eastern tier of counties, where the Cross Timbers ecological region provides some woodland habitat, and to the riparian corridors along the major rivers. The nearest established bear populations are in the Ozarks of Missouri and Arkansas, which are a substantial distance from even the eastern edge of Kansas. The idea of black bears in Kansas is, to most people familiar with the geography, counterintuitive in a way that bears in Iowa or Indiana are not. And yet, bears have been documented in Kansas. Not frequently, not in multiple confirmed individuals simultaneously, but documented, with trail camera images and physical evidence that wildlife managers have confirmed as genuine. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks has acknowledged the sightings, characterized the animals as long-distance dispersers, and noted that the state does not have a bear season or a bear management framework because bears are not considered part of the established Kansas fauna. The distance those animals traveled to reach Kansas from the nearest source populations suggests a dispersal biology that, when combined with the documented range expansion in the states between the Ozarks and the Kansas border, implies a directional pressure that is not yet producing consistent Kansas bear presence, but is probing the landscape for the connectivity and habitat conditions that would make it possible. The Neosho, the Marais des Cygnes, and the Kansas River systems provide riparian corridors that connect the Ozark edge to the interior of Kansas, and those corridors have been improving in terms of cover and food resource availability along the same timeline as the corridors in Iowa and Illinois. Kansas bears are, at the moment, the leading edge of a process that has not yet reached the threshold of self-sustaining presence. But they are not nothing. They are data points on a trajectory, and the trajectory points in a consistent direction. The question of what triggers the formal recognition that a species has recolonized an area rather than merely appeared in it is not a question with a clean scientific answer. It is partly a biological question about population size, breeding conformation, and demographic viability. It is partly a regulatory question about the legal status of the species in the state in question, and the management obligations that recognition creates. And it is partly a political question about who benefits from and who is disadvantaged by the formal acknowledgement that a large omnivore has returned to a landscape that has not contained one in living memory. These three dimensions do not always resolve in the same direction at the same time, and the gaps between them produce the kind of institutional ambiguity that wildlife managers in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kansas are currently navigating. The agricultural dimension of this story is where the abstract ecology meets the concrete economics of rural life in ways that matter to the people most directly affected by bear recolonization. Black bears are not, on the scale of their interactions with agriculture, enormously destructive animals. They do not hunt livestock the way wolves do. They do not kill large numbers of animals in single events the way mountain lions occasionally do. What they do is selectively damage high-value crops in ways that are economically significant to individual producers, even when they are ecologically trivial in the aggregate. Corn is the primary agricultural damage concern across the Midwest, and the damage pattern is specific. Bears enter cornfields in late summer and early fall during the hyperphagia period, when they are maximizing caloric intake before denning. They push stalks over to reach the ears, which is not how corn is harvested by machines, and they consume the ears, which means the damaged stalks produce no harvestable yield even if the ears were not eaten. A single bear in a cornfield over a period of nights can destroy a patch of several acres. In a landscape where every acre of corn has a precisely calculable dollar value, and where margins in commodity agriculture are tight enough that losses of a few acres per field represent a meaningful economic event for a family operation. Even a small number of bears producing this kind of localized damage creates a political problem that wildlife managers cannot simply wave away. The beehive issue is more acute per incident, if less geographically widespread. Black bears destroy beehives with a methodical efficiency that reflects the evolutionary importance of social bee colonies as a fat and protein source during hyperphagia. A single bear that locates an apiary can destroy multiple hives in a single night, with damage that includes not only the immediate loss of bees and honey, but the destruction of the physical hive infrastructure. For hobbyist beekeepers, this is a painful loss. For commercial operations, it is a serious financial event. The documentation of bear damage to apiaries in Iowa and Illinois in recent years has served, in the absence of an official acknowledgement of resident bear populations, as some of the most compelling indirect evidence that bears are not merely passing through these states, but are spending enough time in specific areas to locate and exploit local food resources with the familiarity that implies repeated presence. Livestock predation by black bears is not a major concern in the way that wolf or mountain lion predation is, but it is not non-existent. Bears have been documented killing young livestock in areas where they have become habituated to farm environments, primarily small pigs, lambs, and young goats whose size and defensive incapacity make them accessible targets for an opportunistic omnivore. These incidents are individually alarming to the farmers involved and are politically significant because they transform the abstract question of whether bears should be allowed to re-establish in a given area into a concrete question about who pays for the damage when they do. State livestock depredation compensation programs, which exist in varying forms in most states with established carnivore populations, are not in place in states that do not formally recognize those carnivore populations. The farmer in rural Iowa who loses 3 piglets to a bear has no formal compensation mechanism available because Iowa does not officially have bears. The resulting economic grievance is not irrational and is not solved by pointing out the ecological significance of bear recolonization or the historical injustice of the original extirpation. It is solved by management frameworks that acknowledge the reality of bear presence, allocate resources to documenting and managing that presence, and provide compensation mechanisms for documented agricultural damage. Those frameworks exist in states with established bear populations. They do not yet exist in the states where bears are reappearing, and the gap between the ecological reality and the regulatory infrastructure is where the most serious conflicts are being generated. The road mortality data provides a different kind of window into the bear recolonization picture, because dead bears on roads are harder to argue with than trail camera images or tracks or uncertain sightings. When a 250-pound black bear is struck and killed by a vehicle on an Iowa state highway, it generates a physical specimen that can be aged, sexed, genetically characterized, and located precisely on a map. The collection of road-killed bears from states outside the established range has been building slowly and is now substantial enough to constitute a genuine dataset. Wildlife researchers examining the road-killed bear record from the Midwest have documented animals from multiple age and sex classes, including females, which, as noted earlier, is the sex composition signature of potential recolonization rather than simple dispersal. The genetic data from road-killed animals has been used to trace the source populations from which dispersing individuals are originating, and the results confirm the pattern that geography would predict. Iowa road kills trace genetically to Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Missouri populations. Illinois road kills trace to Missouri, Arkansas, and Tennessee populations. Indiana road kills trace to Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky populations. The genetic signatures are consistent with multiple independent dispersal events from multiple source populations, rather than a single movement corridor, which suggests that the range expansion pressure is broad-based and structurally driven rather than the product of specific local habitat changes in specific corridors. The wildlife management response to this situation has been, across most of the affected states, a posture that can be fairly characterized as watchful acknowledgement, without formal commitment. Wildlife agencies are documenting the sightings, collecting genetic samples from roadkills, maintaining databases of credible reports, and in some cases, installing trail cameras in areas of concentrated activity. What they are not doing, in most cases, is initiating the formal process of establishing bear management programs, setting population objectives, or publicly communicating to residents of bear-appearing counties that the wildlife landscape of their area is changing. The reluctance is understandable from an institutional risk management perspective. Formally acknowledging a resident bear population creates obligations. It triggers review processes under state and sometimes federal wildlife law. It generates pressure from agricultural interests for management actions that limit population growth. It creates pressure from wildlife advocates for protections that prevent those management actions. It produces a public communication challenge for agencies that have been telling their constituents for decades that bears are not part of the local fauna. The path of least institutional resistance is to continue characterizing individual animals as transients until the accumulation of evidence makes that characterization untenable, and the threshold for untenable is remarkably high when the institutional incentives all point in the direction of deferral. The comparison to wolf recolonization in the Great Lakes states and the Pacific Northwest is instructive because it represents the most recent large-scale precedent for how wildlife management systems handle the return of an extirpated predator to landscapes where it has been absent for a generation or more. Wolves returned to Yellowstone through a federal reintroduction program that involved explicit public debate, legal process, and years of political conflict. Wolves returned to the Great Lakes through natural recolonization from Canadian populations and generated a different but equally intense political and legal conflict, focused on the question of when a naturally recolonizing population transitions from federal Endangered Species Act protection to state management authority. The wolf recolonization experience demonstrated several things that are directly relevant to the black bear situation. It demonstrated that wildlife management agencies are institutionally unprepared for natural recolonization events, even when the ecological conditions producing them are clearly visible in advance. It demonstrated that the political conflict over predator return in agricultural landscapes is serious, sustained, and not resolved by the ecological facts of the situation, however compelling those facts may be. And it demonstrated that the window between the first confirmed presence and the formal institutional acknowledgement of established population is often years or even decades long, and that this window is itself a management problem, because the animals are present, are interacting with people and land uses, and are not being managed within any coherent framework. The black bear situation differs from the wolf situation in ways that make it both easier and harder to manage. It is easier because black bears are significantly less controversial than wolves among agricultural communities. Bears do not kill adult cattle. They do not denote the same symbolic weight in the cultural politics of the rural West and Midwest that wolves do. They are generally perceived by the public, including rural publics, with more tolerance and even affection than wolves. State and local hunting traditions around black bears, in states where the species has maintained populations, are robust and represent a constituency that supports regulated bear management rather than opposing bear presence per se. The hunting constituency that exists for bears in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Minnesota has a political relationship with wildlife management agencies that is cooperative rather than adversarial. And that constituency would likely welcome the establishment of bear management programs in new states as a management tool rather than opposing bear presence as such. These factors suggest that the political landscape for managing black bear recolonization in the Midwest is more favorable than it was for wolf recolonization in the Northern Rockies. The harder aspects are different and less often discussed. Black bears are, unlike wolves, animals that interact directly and routinely with human residential environments in ways that generate management challenges that have nothing to do with livestock depredation. The habituation of black bears to human food sources is the most consequential and least controllable aspect of bear management in human-adjacent landscapes, and it is the aspect that no wildlife management framework has yet solved satisfactorily. Black bears that learn to associate human environments with food, whether through unsecured garbage, bird feeders, agricultural waste, or deliberate or inadvertent feeding, undergo a rapid behavioral shift that is nearly irreversible. An animal that has learned to obtain food from human sources does not unlearn that behavior when the food source is removed. It persists in the behavior and escalates the risk-taking involved in pursuing it. The classic outcome of bear habituation to human food sources is a sequence that wildlife managers call the conflict escalation spiral, in which an animal's initial, cautious exploitation of peripheral human food sources gradually transitions to more confident, central, daylight foraging in residential areas, which eventually produces the kind of direct human-bear interaction that results either in the injuring of a human or the lethal removal of the bear. The resolution of the spiral is almost always the death of the bear, because an animal that has reached the late stages of habituation to human food sources is behaviorally incapable of returning to the avoidance responses that would make coexistence possible, and it will not modify its behavior in response to deterrence with the reliability needed to justify continued presence near human habitation. The problem that bear recolonization of the Midwest creates for this dynamic is not primarily about the bears that are currently documented. The current animals, in the small numbers and wide distributions that characterize the early stages of recolonization, are predominantly in rural and forested areas where the food conditioning risk is relatively low. The problem is about what happens when those populations grow and their range expands to encompass the suburban and exurban areas that fringe every major city in the Midwest: Chicago, Indianapolis, Columbus, Kansas City, Des Moines. All of these metropolitan areas are surrounded by the kind of peri-urban and suburban development that, in states with established bear populations, is the primary zone of bear-human conflict. The riparian corridors that bears are using to move through the agricultural Midwest connect directly to the metropolitan peripheries of these cities. The forest preserves and conservation areas that ring these metropolitan areas were not designed with large omnivores in mind, and are not managed with the food security protocols that reduce bear habituation risk. When bears reach these areas in numbers that exceed the current trickle, and the trajectory of the source populations and the improving connectivity of the habitat corridors suggests they will, the management challenges will be qualitatively different from anything these states have handled before. The garbage management issue is worth dwelling on because it is simultaneously the most tractable and the most politically difficult element of bear coexistence management in residential areas. The single most effective intervention for reducing bear-human conflict in residential bear country is securing food attractants, primarily garbage and bird feeders, in ways that prevent bears from accessing them. This is not a controversial scientific finding. It is as well established as any finding in applied wildlife management. Bear-resistant garbage containers, properly secured in garages or bear-proof enclosures, eliminate the primary mechanism by which black bears become habituated to residential areas. The problem is that implementing this intervention at the scale needed to make a difference in a metropolitan area requires a combination of regulation, infrastructure investment, and sustained public education that no Midwestern city or county has yet had reason to undertake, because bears have not been a local management consideration. By the time the need becomes acute, the institutional infrastructure to respond to it will not exist, and the lag between recognizing the need and building the institutional capacity to address it is measured in years. This is not a hypothetical future problem. It is the predictable consequence of a recolonization process that is already underway and moving faster than the regulatory and management systems in the affected states are tracking. The public communication question sits at the center of all of this. Wildlife agencies in the Midwest are in a position that is, from a communications standpoint, genuinely uncomfortable. They have an obligation to inform the public about significant changes in the wildlife landscape. They have an equal obligation to avoid generating unnecessary alarm about a situation that is, at present, not producing significant human safety events. They have an institutional interest in deferring the political conflicts that formal acknowledgement of bear recolonization would generate, and they have a professional commitment to accuracy that sits in tension with all three of the other pressures. The result is communications that are technically accurate, that acknowledge individual confirmed sightings, that provide safety guidance for bear encounters, but that do not clearly and publicly describe the direction and the momentum of the trend. The person in rural Indiana who sees a bear on their trail camera and calls their state wildlife agency is told that this is an unusual occurrence, that the animal is likely a transient, and that they should enjoy the rare sighting. What they are not told is that their state is receiving more of these reports every year, that the genetic data from road kills suggests multiple independent source populations contributing to the reports, that neighboring states with better developed monitoring programs are documenting the same trend, and that the structural conditions driving the trend, growing source populations and improving habitat connectivity, are not conditions that are expected to reverse. The individual caller's experience of the situation as a curious anomaly is accurate in the immediate sense. The framing that wildlife agencies are providing does not give that caller the broader context that would allow them to understand what the anomaly is part of. The researcher community working on bear recolonization in the Midwest is producing a body of work that, taken together, describes a process that is further advanced than the public communications of state wildlife agencies suggest. Academic papers on black bear habitat suitability modeling in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana have been appearing with increasing frequency since the mid-2010s. The consistent finding of this modeling work is that the habitat in these states, particularly along the major river corridors, is substantially more suitable for black bears than historical absence would suggest. The models, which incorporate forest cover, human land use intensity, road density, and connectivity to source populations, identify large areas of the eastern and southern Midwest as having habitat characteristics that could support black bear populations if animals were able to reach them. The genetic and distribution data coming in from sightings and roadkills is increasingly confirming what the models predicted. The convergence of model predictions and empirical documentation is the kind of pattern that, in a different institutional context, would be generating formal policy discussions about how to manage an ongoing and structurally driven process of range expansion. In the current institutional context, it is generating individual agency responses to individual incidents without a coherent framework connecting those responses. The question of whether the recolonization should be actively facilitated, passively allowed, or managed to a stable limit is one that wildlife management in the affected states has not begun to answer in any public forum, and the absence of that discussion is itself a management problem. In states with established bear populations, the tension between bear conservation and agricultural tolerance is managed through a combination of regulated hunting that maintains population density below the level that maximizes conflict, compensation programs that address agricultural losses, and public education programs that maintain the behavioral practices in residential areas that reduce habituation risk. This management toolkit took decades to develop and is imperfect in every state that employs it, but it exists. In Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kansas, it does not exist. The states are currently in the position of managing individual incidents without any framework for managing the population-level process that is producing those incidents. The individual incident management, which defaults to lethal removal of bears that create conflicts, may be producing a selection effect on the recolonizing population. The animals that are killed are, disproportionately, the ones that are most willing to enter agricultural and residential areas, the boldest and least wary individuals. If those behavioral traits are heritable, which there is reasonable evidence to suggest they are in part, The removal of bold individuals from the recolonizing population may be gradually selecting for a more wary, conflict-avoidant population, which would be a desirable outcome from a management perspective. But this is not a deliberate management strategy. It is a possibly beneficial side effect of unsystematic removal decisions made by individual wildlife officers responding to individual complaints. Relying on this effect as a management outcome without deliberately designing for it is not a policy. It is an accident. The question of what Midwestern residents should actually know about this situation and what they should actually do about it deserves a direct answer that the current official communications are not quite providing. The safety picture for humans in states where bears are reappearing is not alarming. Black bears are not aggressive predators of humans in the way that popular culture sometimes suggests. The North American record of fatal black bear attacks is sobering in specific incidents, but is not large in aggregate. Black bears kill fewer people per year in North America than domestic dogs, and substantially fewer than deer, which are responsible for vehicle collision fatalities at a rate that dwarfs any wildlife predation figure. The behavioral disposition of black bears toward humans is fundamentally one of avoidance. Bears that encounter humans almost universally choose to leave. The encounters that turn dangerous share characteristics, primarily involving a bear that has been food conditioned and has lost its wariness of humans, that are associated with specific management failures rather than with intrinsic bear behavior. A wild, non-food conditioned black bear encountering a human is extraordinarily unlikely to behave aggressively. The risk profile of recolonizing bears in the Midwest, which are predominantly wild, non-food conditioned animals in the early stages of range expansion, is very low for direct human safety. What is not low risk, and what residents of bear-appearing areas should understand practically, is the agricultural and property damage potential and the long-term risk that follows if bears in the region become food-conditioned. The practical guidance is both simple and underappreciated. Securing food attractants is the single most important action that individual landowners can take to ensure that bears moving through their area do not become habituated to that area as a food resource. Unsecured garbage, bird feeders left out overnight, accessible pet food, and agricultural waste are the primary food conditioning pathways for black bears in human-adjacent environments. They are also the primary drivers of the conflict escalation spiral that leads to the lethal removal of individual animals. Bears that cannot access human-provided food in an area have no incentive to return to that area, and no mechanism for developing the habituation that makes conflict likely. Bears that can access human-provided food will return, will become more comfortable, will bring the problem that wildlife managers in established bear country have been dealing with for decades. The prevention is straightforward. The implementation requires consistent individual behavior that people do not naturally maintain in areas where bears have not been present, and where the personal experience of a bear incident is, for most individuals, still zero. The hunting community in the Midwest has been among the more alert constituencies in tracking bear recolonization, for reasons that combine recreational interest in bear as a game species with the practical observation that hunters spend more time in the field, in more remote areas, and with more attention to wildlife sign than most other segments of the population. Trail cameras deployed for deer hunting in Iowa and Illinois have generated a significant proportion of the documented bear images from those states. Hunting forums and social media groups focused on Midwestern hunting have been accumulating bear sighting reports for over a decade. The hunting community's interest in the management question is not purely recreational. Hunters in states with established bear seasons understand that regulated harvest is a management tool that shapes bear population demographics, distribution, and behavior in ways that reduce conflict and maintain population size within the carrying capacity of the habitat. The absence of a bear hunting season in states where bears are reappearing means the absence of one of the primary management tools that would be available for shaping the recolonization process in ways that minimize conflict. Wildlife agencies in the affected states that decide to formally acknowledge resident bear populations will face immediate pressure from hunting constituencies to establish regulated seasons, and that pressure will intersect with equally immediate pressure from wildlife protection constituencies to resist any harvest of a newly recolonizing population. The political geometry of that intersection is familiar from the wolf experience and is not easily resolved. The long-term ecological implications of black bear recolonization in the Midwest are genuinely significant and are almost entirely missing from the public discussion, which has focused almost entirely on human safety and agricultural conflict. Bears are ecosystem engineers in a meaningful sense. Their foraging behavior, particularly their consumption and dispersal of hard mast, including acorns, hickory nuts, and beech nuts, makes them significant agents of forest regeneration in the landscapes where they are present. Their predation on fawns and on the young of other prey species shapes ungulate population demographics in ways that have cascading effects through the food web. Their role as consumers of carrion connects them to the nutrient cycling processes of forest ecosystems in ways that are not easily replaced by other species. The Midwestern forests, from which bears were extirpated over a century ago, have been developing in the absence of this ecological function for multiple generations. The return of bears to these forests is not simply the return of an animal. It is the partial restoration of an ecological process. The consequences of that restoration for forest composition, ungulate population dynamics, and the broader ecological functioning of Midwestern forest systems are questions that have barely been asked, let alone answered. The bees question is worth returning to in this ecological context because it captures an interesting irony in the human response to bear recolonization. The same agricultural community that is most concerned about bear damage to commercial apiaries is also, in many areas of the Midwest, deeply engaged with pollinator conservation programs aimed at reversing the decline of wild bees, including wild bee species whose populations have been declining for decades due to agricultural intensification, pesticide use, and habitat loss. Black bears raid both commercial honeybee operations and wild bee colonies with equal opportunism. Their impact on wild bee populations is not well studied and is probably not significant at the landscape scale, given the small number of recolonizing individuals currently present. But it is a genuine tension in the ecological picture, one of many that the recolonization process will surface as bear numbers grow and their interactions with both the agricultural and the ecological landscape of the Midwest intensify. The citizen science dimension of the bear recolonization story is something that state wildlife agencies have been slowly and somewhat reluctantly embracing, again, for institutional reasons that are understandable, but that have resulted in a monitoring dataset that is less comprehensive than it could be. The volume of bear sightings being reported to state agencies, posted on social media, documented on trail cameras, and called in to local police and wildlife hotlines constitutes a rich data stream that, properly aggregated and systematically verified, would provide a substantially better picture of the current distribution, density, and behavioral characteristics of recolonizing bears in the Midwest than the formal monitoring programs of underfunded state agencies can produce on their own. Some researchers are working with this data stream. The institutional frameworks for doing so formally, with proper protocols for verification, geolocation, and storage, are not yet in place in most of the affected states. What is clear is that what is happening is real and is not reversing. The structural drivers of black bear recolonization in the Midwest, growing and healthy source populations, improving habitat connectivity along river corridors, the ecological flexibility of the bear itself, and the slowly improving regulatory environment in states that have not yet established formal management programs are all operating in the same direction. The animals appearing in Iowa cornfields and on Illinois trail cameras and on Kansas highways are not anomalies. They are the scouts of a process that is already underway and that will continue regardless of whether wildlife management institutions decide to formally acknowledge it.